Hey guys, week 9, big summary of messiest issues videos. Let's go ahead and video just one of them. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I have to say that, so we're covering chapter 6 and we're covering just the one article about designing higher education. I have to tell you right up front that behaviorism, I find this super fascinating, so I can't wait for I am not a behaviorist, but I find it really fascinating, and I can't wait for our discussion on Thursday. And just to kind of see what you all think. And I think we're going to have some fun talking about it. But here's the big summary. Okay, lots of points here, so I'm not going to go into depth on all of them, but just to touch on some of the things that I think are impactful. First, behaviorism isn't a philosophy. It's probably most aptly characterized as a psychological theory. It's rooted strongly in realism and materialism. It makes the point that behavior is caused by environmental conditions. So behavior meaning what a person, does, both on a consistent basis, so patterns of behavior, but also and in the moment. Both of those are affected heavily by environmental conditions. Next, understanding human nature can be done by understanding behavior. So the understanding what is man can be done primarily through, or maybe not even primarily, but can be accomplished by understanding patterns, especially of behavior. And the patterns part is, I think, important. Next, modern behaviorists relate to behavioral sciences. Basically, and I think the second part is really interesting. Any type of person can be created through scientific conditioning. So, behavioral sciences is a really important piece of terminology to remember, particularly the word sciences. So, behavioral sciences. So, behaviorism is an attempt or is a philosophical view of behavior as an operational and scientific approach to understanding human behavior. So that comes through in the chapter, as you will or have read, and I just want to highlight that the science part is important. Next, behaviorists believe that children are engineered by their environment, and far before they reach school, Skinner wanted to replace the haphazard programming that he believed that they received with something systematic and meaningful. That's how I think, if you had to boil down Skinner's view of education as a system, that would be it. That the environment creates children and behavior in children, and that happens from lots of different sources, and there's really sort of no scientific approach to it. And there's certainly no mechanical or operational approach to it. School should be a place where the environment, the school, and its effect on the individual behavior is harnessed in an replicable and mechanical and scientific way. Next, the primary aim of behaviorist techniques is to change behavior to be more positive. Again, I think this is heavily influenced by Skinner, but basically the statement here is that if the environment matters and that creates behavior, then why not try to create positive behavior? And that can be a goal of education. Many tenets of behaviorism, particularly through behavior modification, are seen in education, even if educators don't like the terminology. So I think this is probably, and I'll get to this a little bit on the next slide, but this is probably something that we'll talk a lot about on Thursday night's class. But basically, this just means that behavior modification or any intentional approach to change individuals' ongoing behavior are seen quite a bit in education, and that educators don't particularly care for that way of describing what we do. And finally, in some ways, this basically boils down to the nature versus nurture debate, although, of course, it is much more complex than that. Dialectic there with the either or categorization of nature versus nurture, but I think the book posed that, and I think it's a good way to think of it. Okay, so that's a quick summary of kind of a heavy chapter. Although, of course, we're going to dig much more into it on Thursday. Just a few little points here that I wanted to raise on the messiest issues. Behavioral science or behavioral engineering, both of those terms are used in the book, and I think that they're both important to understand. They're very similar, but I think they are different things. So behavioral science is just basically what I talked about a little bit a few minutes ago, which is the scientific method being used to understand human behavior and human nature. Behavioral engineering, I think you can think of it as the next logical step or as the practical application of learnings from behavioral science. So if behavioral science is about applying science to understanding human behavior and human nature, behavioral engineering is about using those learnings to then adapt human behavior. Okay, so is behaviorism one or the other? Nope, it's a little bit of both. It's probably somewhere in between, probably influenced by both of those things, and certainly contains both of those ideas. They are different, but they both are related to and build up into behaviorism. Okay. Next point is education behavioral engineering. I'm not going to answer that in this video. I do want to raise it as a point that we'll get into quite a bit on Thursday. If I had to ask you all just one question, if we just had a half an hour to debate something, that would be the question. So I raise that just to say that's a messy one. I'm not going to give you my thought because I want to go through it on Thursday, but just know that we're going to get into it. And so, just kind of be collecting your thoughts. And then finally, environment or engineering. This is very related to the first, somewhat related to the first bullet point there, but basically which is most important, the environment or engineering? Again, kind of both, to a behaviorist, I should say, kind of both. So a behaviorist believes very heavily that the environment really is what influences human development and then, of course, human behavior, but also that most behaviorists believe that that behavior can be engineered by understanding the environment and by producing a different type of environment, whether that's on a large scale or in a scale as small as a classroom or a family home. They believe that the behavior can be altered through engineering. So again, they believe both. Okay. So that's the quick summary and some key issues that I thought might not be super easily grasped from Chapter 6. Now, you probably noticed in that the article was written by Skinner, which I think is kind of, obviously it's done purposefully, but I think it's kind of cool because the chapter focuses so heavily on Skinner's work, and obviously Skinner was so influential to the, to the behaviorist movement. So the Skinner article, first of all, I always like to point out when something is not super modern that this is, some of the terminology may feel antiquated, and that's because it was written in 1974. Although this is maybe not too much to that, not so much antiquated, but anyway, it's written in 1974, and yes, it's the same Skinner as in the book. So next point, the idea of teaching as the transmission of what is already known is unpopular and has largely been replaced by the facilitation of discovery. So think about like our classroom, right? I told you the first night, and I think we've held true to it, that I'm not going to just stand up there and deliver to you the knowledge that I feel that I have related to philosophy and higher education. In fact, I'm going to facilitate your learning, and we're going to co-create your own advanced understanding, right? So I very much am a product of what Skinner is referencing. I am not transmitting knowledge to you. And I think that's just to use that as an example of what he's describing here. I will say that I don't think I put it in this or in the next slide, but Skinner uses the idea of transmitting culture and transmitting knowledge somewhat interchangeably, so just highlight that for yourself. And I think if you're having trouble delineating between the two, you can just think of them as somewhat interchangeable, the transmission of culture and the transmission of knowledge. So next, effective design is needed for the masses of teachers and students, and it should be based on behavioral processes. So I wrote for the masses. What that means is, and I'll get into this a bit on the next slide, those students and teachers who are not on either end of the spectrum in terms of traditionally what you would think of as a great student or a great teacher, but sort of the people who are, somewhere other than that. That effective design can be helpful in producing outcomes that someone like Skinner would like to see. Next, punitive processes have always been a part of education. The real world experience, meaning experiences and environment, should not be abandoned in education. But also Skinner makes the point that they shouldn't wholly take over the curriculum either. Punishment should be replaced with reward in teaching, but reward in the right way. Skinner says that reward has been the idea of reward has been misunderstood by the layperson as simply the production of positive results. What Skinner asserts is that those positive results have to happen with the correct frequency at the right time in the right moment with the right dosage. So it can't just be good things happening. They have to be happening in, again, a well-designed way. And finally, exploration is important and great, but how can that happen without the transmission of culture or knowledge? So I think that's probably, again, the most key summary point to how Skinner thinks about higher education, which is all of that exploration is great, but you really have to focus on transferring knowledge. All right, so some of the messiest issues. The idol of the good. So I referenced this or at least alluded to it just a second ago. The idol of the good is basically thinking about the good teacher and the good student, and not thinking about what we talk about in higher education today now as the murky middle. So Skinner basically is saying that, yeah, wonderful results can happen when there are really good teachers and really good students, and particularly if they're in the same place at the same time. But that's haphazard. And so we can get good results when that happens, but we shouldn't wait for that sort of miracle to occur. What we need to be doing is setting in place standards and curriculum or processes or design, as Skinner would say, which would produce those good results for the quote-unquote average teacher or quote-unquote average student. And so he basically rejects the idol of the good. Secondly, reward. Again, I got into this a little bit there with one of the last points on the last slide, but that reward should be used in place of punitive, or should be more important than punitive practices in the classroom, but it must be done in the right way. It can't just be blind reward. Anytime something good occurs, it has to be done, again, with design. And then finally, Skinner makes a point which he acknowledges up front is likely to be unpopular, but that it's important to differentiate between the educated and not, because that sounds very crass, and I didn't even like typing it or saying it. But Skinner's point is, if you don't differentiate between the educated and the not, then who would you know how to educate? And that the whole entire point of education is to bring people from one point to another, and so that begets identifying the first point, the point at which people start, and then basically acknowledging we want to advance you further. And so it's just an interesting, I think, way of coming to that conclusion, and I think it's a good indication of how a behaviorist thinks about these things. So maybe and this is something I think we'll talk a lot about on Thursday also, maybe some of the core philosophy, because remember, this is really best thought of as a behavioral science, maybe some of the core philosophy might be the same as what you see in modern higher education. We want to advance people the best that we can. It's just maybe the starting place and the particulars around it might differ for a behaviorist. And so hopefully that's a little bit of help. Again, I think this is a really interesting one, so I'm really looking forward to talking to you all about this on Thursday. We will do our typical structure. We'll go through both the article and the chapter, and we'll do a case study at the end, and do a little housekeeping stuff too, just like we normally do. All right. So looking forward to see you all in class, and let me know if you need anything. Thanks.